John 911, where's your emergency?
1810 Cedar Street, please.
What's wrong?
My wife had an accident. She's still breathing.
What kind of
She's
accident?
down on the stairs. She's still breathing. Please come.
Is she conscious?
What?
Is she conscious?
No, she's not conscious.
Okay, how many stairs did you
What?
fall down?
Huh?
How many stairs?
Stairs.
How many stairs? Calm down, sir. Calm down.
No, 15, 20, I don't know. Please, get somebody here right away. Please.
Okay, somebody's dispatching the ambulance while I ask you questions.
It's a force field, okay? Please, please.
Okay, sir, somebody else is dispatching the ambulance. Okay, is she awake now? Hello? Hello?
It's 2:40 a.m. on December 9th, 2001. Durham, North Carolina. The temperature has dropped into the low 50s. Inside a sprawling 10,000 square foot mansion, a local newspaper columnist and author named Michael Peterson says he was sitting out by the pool. He says he came inside and found his wife, Kathleen, crumpled at the bottom of the back staircase. It was a tragic late-night accident. When paramedics rushed through the front doors of 1810 Cedar Street, they expect a tragic slip and fall. They expect a broken neck, maybe a fractured spine. They do not expect a slaughterhouse. There is blood everywhere. It's pooled on the floor in thick, dark quantities. It's smeared across the walls. It's splattered high up on the staircase, sprayed in tiny red droplets that tell a story of a brutal, frenzied beating. Kathleen Peterson isn't just dead. She has 7 deep, massive lacerations across the back of her scalp. She looks like she was beaten to death with a fire poker. And the only other person in the house is her husband. It looks like an open and shut case of domestic murder. But when the autopsy results come back, the medical examiner finds something physically impossible. 7 massive lacerations, no brain swelling, and 0 skull fractures. If a human beat her to death, her skull would be shattered. So to secure a conviction, the prosecution couldn't rely on the physical evidence because it didn't make sense. Instead, they had to put Michael Peterson's deepest secrets on trial. They built a case on homophobia, moral panic, and character assassination. Welcome back to Homocidal Tendency, everyone. I'm your host, Matt. And as you know, I took a short break to recharge the batteries, and it feels really good to be back behind the mic. So first and foremost, since it's June, and this is the first proper episode I'm dropping in June, I just want to kick off by saying Happy Pride to everyone out there. And honestly, it's a good time to cover today's case. As we celebrate Pride and look back at the fights the queer community has had to endure, we also have to look at the dark side of how the justice system has historically weaponized sexuality. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a literal murder trial where a man's bisexuality was put on the stand and treated as a smoking gun. It's a stark reminder of why Pride started as a riot and why visibility matters so much. Before we get into the heavy stuff, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're enjoying the show, please take 30 seconds to drop us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening right now. It's the absolute best way to help the algorithm push us out to new listeners. And also, don't forget to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, and Twitter/X. I'll be posting all the crime scene photos, clips from the trial, and yes, the owl diagrams we're going to discuss today. All right, the housekeeping's done. Take a deep breath, settle in, and let's head back to Durham, North Carolina. When we left off in the cold open, paramedics had just walked into the Peterson home. What they found at the bottom of the stairs defied all logic. So, let's talk about what the paramedics actually saw when they crossed the threshold of 1810 Cedar Street at 2:48 a.m. Because on television, a fall down the stairs looks clean. A quick slip, a tragic angle, a single point of impact. But the back staircase of the Peterson mansion looked like something out of a Wes Craven film. When paramedics walked towards the small, cramped stairwell, They saw the lower half of 48-year-old Kathleen Peterson's body protruding onto the hardwood floor. Her legs were spread wide. Her husband, Michael, is crouching over her, drenched in sweat and crying. But as the paramedics stepped closer to check for a pulse, their medical training slams into a jarring conflict with what their eyes are seeing. First, it's the sheer volume of blood. It wasn't just a puddle under her head, it's everywhere. It's splattered into a chaotic matrix across the narrow wooden walls of the stairwell, rising up several feet. It's soaked deep into Kathleen's gray sweatpants at the waist. It's caked in thick, dark clumps throughout her hair. But it's the state of the blood that makes the first responders freeze. As you heard in the 911 call from the opening, Michael had called 911 just 8 minutes prior, screaming that Kathleen was, quote unquote, still breathing, and that he had just walked inside from the pool to find her. But paramedics, they've reached down and they touched the pool of blood beneath Kathleen's head. It isn't bright, slick, or flowing. It's coagulated. It's clotted, starting to harden and sticking to the skin. And the blood on the clothes, completely dried at the touch. And then when they look at the walls, the dark red patterns aren't just gravity-driven drops. They're massive, thick smears and swipe marks cutting through spatter. Visual evidence that looked like, to the experienced eyes of the medics, that someone had actually tried to wipe the blood away. And it doesn't stop there. The anomalies keep stacking up. Right next to Kathleen's left foot sits a roll of red splattered paper towels and a pile of wadded up bloody sheets. And right next to those sits Michael Peterson's white athletic shoes with fine droplets of blood standing out in a sharp, perfect relief against the white leather. When the paramedics ask Michael how long it's been since the fall, he doesn't give a timeline. He just repeats a strange, fragmented mantra. I just went outside to turn off the pool lights, and I came back in. Then he walks away from his dying wife, wanders into the kitchen, and eventually walks out to the patio alone. By 3 a.m., the Durham Police Department arrives, and the accident theory is effectively dead. To the investigators, this isn't a slip. This is a beating. They look closer at Michael. He is barefoot, wearing a dark navy blue t-shirt and khaki shorts. Even on the dark fabric, the blood is obvious. Small, fine speckles of high-velocity blood splatter cover his arms, his legs, his hands, and crucially, the inside of his shorts. And just like the blood on Kathleen, every single drop on Michael is completely dry. The police look at the scene, they look at the husband, and they draw a straight line between the two. They lock down the mansion, secure a search warrant, and call the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. But as the detectives begin tracing the bloody wall, looking for where the violence started, they find something that completely disrupts the narrative, a domestic brawl inside a cramped stairwell. Because they walk away from the stairs, past the kitchen, and open the door leading outside, and there, shining under the flashlights on the front porch, are isolated drops of Kathleen's blood, outside, feet away from the house. The prosecution would later argue Michael must have chased her outside or carried a weapon past the porch. But they were looking for a human killer. They were looking for a motive. And in their rush to turn a chaotic scene into a conviction, they completely missed what those outside blood drops actually meant. Because while the police were busy looking inside Michael's computer for a scandalous secret to present to a jury, the real clue was still tangled in the hairs of Kathleen's severed scalp. When a body leaves a crime scene, it stops being a person and becomes a puzzle. And the puzzle of Kathleen Peterson's autopsy is where the entire case fractures. Dr. Kenneth Snell was the medical examiner who first arrived at the house, but the actual autopsy was performed by Dr. Deborah Reddish at the State Morgue in Chapel Hill. She's the one who shaves Kathleen's head, cleans away the coagulated blood, and finally gets a clear look at the damage. What she finds is horrific. There are 7 distinct massive lacerations across the back and top of Kathleen's scalp. These aren't scratches. They're deep, ragged tears, some of them 2 to 3 inches long, cut all the way down to the bone. Dr. Reddish looks at the severity of the cuts, looks at the blood loss, and officially rules the death a homicide by blunt force trauma. Her conclusion? Someone beat Kathleen Peterson to death. But there's a massive, glaring paradox in that conclusion. To understand that paradox, you have to understand the anatomy of the human head. The scalp is incredibly vascular, which means it bleeds like crazy, but it's also incredibly thin. There's almost zero padding between your skin and your skull. If a grown man takes a solid metal object like a fireplace blowpoke, the prosecution eventually claimed Michael used, and swings it at a woman's head with enough violence to split her scalp open 7 different times, the bone's going to break. It's simple physics. A metal pipe hitting a human skull with homicidal force will cause fractures. It will cause several subdermal hematomas. The brain will swell. But Dr. Rashi's own autopsy report confirms the impossible. Kathleen Peterson had 0 skull fractures, not a single crack, not even a hairline fracture, and her brain was completely intact. There was no swelling, no brain damage, no subdermal hematoma. The cartilage in her neck was unbroken. She didn't have the typical defensive bruising on her forearms and hands that you would see in someone trying to block a barrage of blows from a heavy weapon. If this was a beating, it was a beating that defies the laws of biomechanics. It was a weapon that was sharp enough to flay the scalp in deep, trident-shaped gouges, but soft enough to leave the brittle bone underneath completely untouched. The defense team's forensic experts immediately point this out. They argued that a fall down the stairs could cause lacerations if she struck sharp edges of the wooden steps, but they admit that the sheer number and the shape of the cuts are bizarre for a simple fall. So here's where we are. You have 2 compelling theories. The prosecution says it was a brutal beating with a metal pipe despite the pristine skull. The defense says it was a tragic, multi-impact fall down the stairs despite the massive volume of blood and strange shape of the wounds. Neither side has a weapon. Neither side has a theory that perfectly matches the physical reality of the body. To understand why the police jumped straight to murder and why the trial became an absolute circus, we have to rewind the tape. We need to step out of the bloody stairwell and look at who Michael and Kathleen Peterson actually were. And because on paper, they were Durham royalty. Let's start with Kathleen. Kathleen Peterson was not just a housewife living in a big mansion. She was an absolute force of nature. She was the first woman ever accepted into the engineering program at Duke University. By 2001, she was a high-powered, highly paid telecommunications executive at Nortel Networks. She was the primary breadwinner, a philanthropist, and widely beloved in the community. She was the kind of woman who threw massive, elegant dinner parties, remembered everyone's birthday, and kept a chaotic, blended family from flying apart at the seams. But she was also carrying an immense amount of weight. The dot-com bubble had just burst, and Nortel was hemorrhaging money and laying off thousands of employees. Kathleen was stressed, working grueling hours, and trying to keep the Peterson lifestyle afloat. Then you have Michael. Michael Peterson was a Vietnam veteran and a modestly successful author who wrote gritty military novels. But locally in Durham, he was known for being a provocateur. He wrote a regular column for the local newspaper where he routinely and viciously criticized the Durham Police Department and the local city government. He called them corrupt, and he called them incompetent. He was charismatic, incredibly articulate, and undeniably arrogant. He was a man who loved to hold court. Because of his columns, he had made some very powerful enemies in the exact same police department that would eventually respond to his 911 call. Together, Michael and Kathleen were the center of a massive, sprawling modern family. Between them, they had 5 children from previous marriages and adoptions. They lived together in a 10,000 square foot mansion surrounded by 3 acres of woods on Cedar Street. To the outside world, they were the ultimate power couple, intellectual, wealthy, and deeply in love. Friends described them as absolute soulmates who were constantly holding hands and finishing each other's sentences. But financially, they were living wildly beyond their means. They had maxed out credit cards and massive debt. But there was something else, a secret that the prosecution would eventually use as the linchpin to destroy Michael's life. Behind the facade of that perfect marriage, Michael Peterson was living a second life. He was bisexual. He frequently visited gay porn sites, and he actively exchanged emails to arrange meetups with young male sex workers. In the early 2000s, in the American South, this was a scandal waiting to detonate. When the police seize Michael's computer and find these emails, they think they have the motive locked down. The theory writes itself. Kathleen sat down at the computer, found the emails, confronted him about his infidelity and sexuality, and Michael killed her to keep his secret safe. It's a brilliant, highly compelling narrative for the prosecutor to sell to the jury. There's only one problem. According to Michael, and corroborated by realities of their incredibly intimate marriage. Kathleen already knew. Michael's bisexuality wasn't a dark, explosive secret he was willing to murder to protect. It was an unspoken, understood arrangement between a husband and a wife. A don't ask, don't tell dynamic that allowed them to stay together while Michael privately sought out what he needed. Kathleen wasn't going to leave him over it. She wasn't going to ruin him over it. She already accepted it. Which means the prosecution's entire motive, the spark that allegedly ignited the murder, was an absolute fabrication. Before we can look at the trial, we have to address the massive bleeding elephant in the room. It's the detail that split the jury and the detail that makes this case infuriatingly complex. And that is the missing 2 hours. Because whether you believe Michael Peterson is a cold-blooded killer, the autopsy proves one absolute horrific fact. Kathleen Peterson did not die instantly. The medical examiner found red neurons in her brain, a biological marker of prolonged oxygen deprivation. That means Kathleen lay at the bottom of the stairwell, bleeding out for at least 45 minutes and possibly up to 2 hours before the paramedics even arrived. So, where was Michael? Michael's official story is earlier in the night, they were celebrating. A movie studio had just optioned one of his books. They rented American Sweethearts, drank some wine, and went out to the patio. Around midnight, Kathleen went inside because she had an early conference call. Michael says he stayed outside. He claims he sat in the lounge chair, smoked his pipe, looking at the stars, and eventually dozed off. He says because the property was massive and because the pool's water fountain was running, the ambient noise completely drowned out any sound coming from the house. He didn't wake up and go inside until roughly 2:30 a.m. The prosecution looked at the story and tore it to shreds. They pointed out the weather. It was mid-December. Yes, it was a mild night for winter, but it was still 50 degrees outside, and Michael was wearing a t-shirt and khaki shorts. Prosecutors asked the jury, what sane, sober man accidentally falls asleep outside in 50-degree weather in shorts for 2 hours? The prosecution theorized that Michael was wide awake. They argued those 2 hours were spent staging. They claimed he used that time to wash the murder weapon, try to clean up the footprint smears, and to delete files off his computer. And most chilling, the prosecution suggested Michael couldn't call 911 until he absolutely was sure that Kathleen was dead. If she survived, she could testify against him. But wait, what about the 911 call? Michael is screaming. She's still breathing. How can the blood be completely dry and coagulated, but she's still taking breaths? This is where the medical science can get really dark. When a human body experiences massive trauma and the brain is starved of oxygen, the brainstem can trigger a reflex called agonal respiration. It sounds like sudden, heavy, gasping snores. It's often called a death rattle. It's not true breathing, it's a reflex of dying, and sometimes of a recently deceased body. The defense experts argue that Michael walked in, heard this horrible gasping, panicked, and made the call. The prosecution argues Michael knew exactly what it was and simply used the phrase, "she is still breathing," to sell the dispatcher on his innocence. The prosecution had their motive, and they had their missing 2 hours. But to convince a jury that Michael Peterson staged a brutal beating to look like a staircase fall, they needed to show he had a blueprint. And to do that, they took the jury back in time, 18 years earlier, to Germany. In 1985, Michael and his first wife were living in Germany, and they were incredibly close to a neighbor named Elizabeth Radcliffe. One night, Michael walked Elizabeth home after dinner. He was the last person to see her alive. The next morning, Elizabeth was found dead. The location? The bottom of a staircase? At the time, German and U.S. military authorities investigated. They ruled it an accident, a cerebral hemorrhage that caused the fatal fall. It was a tragedy. Michael even stepped up and became the guardian of Elizabeth's 2 young daughters, Margaret and Martha, raising them as his own. But let's fast forward to the 2003 trial. The Durham prosecutors looked at Michael, looked at Kathleen, and realized they were staring at a man whose life had featured 2 women bleeding to death at the bottom of a staircase. Lightning doesn't strike twice at the same spot, does it? The prosecution went to extreme lengths. They actually had Elizabeth Ratliff's body exhumed from her grave and brought to North Carolina. The exact same medical examiner who autopsied Kathleen performed a second autopsy on Elizabeth. Her conclusion? She changed the official cause of death. Elizabeth didn't just die from a fall. She died from blunt force trauma. But the state didn't explicitly charge Michael with Elizabeth's murder. They didn't have to, and they just had to plant the seed in the jury's mind. They argued that Elizabeth's death showed Michael exactly what a fatal fall looked like. It gave him the perfect, tragic blueprint for Kathleen. But when you don't have a murder weapon and your autopsy report completely contradicts your theory of a brutal beating, you need a distraction. You need a story so salacious, so shocking, that the jury stops looking at the physical evidence and starts looking at the man. For the Durham Police Department and District Attorney Jim Hardin, that story was hidden inside the hard drive of Michael Peterson's computer. Like we said, and the investigators pull the computer from the Cedar Street house. They dig through the files, the browser history, the deleted folders, and they hit what they consider an absolute jackpot. They find a series of emails between Michael and a 28-year-old male escort known as Brad. And these emails are explicit. They involve exchanging photos, discussing rates, and making plans to meet up. Now, remember what we talked about before. Michael maintains Kathleen knew about his bisexuality, but the prosecution realizes they don't have to prove Kathleen didn't know. They just have to prove that a conservative, early 2000s North Carolina jury would just find it disgusting. They didn't just use his bisexuality as a piece of the puzzle. They weaponized it. They turned the courtroom into a theater of moral panic. To really understand the sheer prejudice of this trial, you have to look back at the prosecution's heavy hitter, Assistant District Attorney Frederick Black. Frederick Black was a master of the Southern style of courtroom theatrics. She had the heavy Southern drawl, the dramatic pauses, and the deeply ingrained judgmental conservatism that perfectly mirrored the jury box. And when she got up to speak, she completely abandoned the blood splatter and lacerations. Instead, she projected Michael's emails on a massive screen for everyone to see. She printed out the explicit photos. Michael had saved the photos of the gay men, and she held them up like she was holding up radioactive waste. So I want to read you an actual quote from Freda Black's closing arguments. She stands in front of the jury, points at the evidence board, and says, "He was going to a website, and if you look at the photos, I don't know what you call it, but it's pure tea filth. That's what it is, pure tea filth. People who engage in this kind of activity, they're living a lie. They're living a double life." So think about the context here. It's 2003. This is before Lawrence versus Texas that struck down sodomy laws nationwide. Gay marriage is illegal everywhere. The culture climate in the American South is overwhelmingly hostile towards the LGBTQ+ community. And here is the prosecution explicitly telling a jury, bisexual men are liars. Bisexual men are deviants. And because he is deviant, he is capable of murder. They actually put the sexual worker Brad on the witness stand. And why is that? Because he and Michael had never met in person. The meetup fell through. Brad had zero information about Kathleen's death. He had zero information about the night of the incident. His only purpose on the stand was to be a smear campaign. The prosecution paraded him into the courtroom so the jury could physically look at the kind of man Michael Peterson was attracted to. It was an assassination of character disguised as establishing a motive. The state's entire narrative hinged on one hypothetical moment. Kathleen was using Michael's computer, stumbled across the pure tea filth, confronted him, threatened to expose him, and ruin his Durham reputation, and Michael bludgeoned her to death in a panic. There was no forensic proof Kathleen ever saw those emails. There was no proof she was on his computer that night, but it didn't matter. The smoke and mirrors worked. The trial of Michael Peterson stopped being an inquiry into the tragic death of a beloved mother, wife, and executive. It became the trial of a bisexual man's private life. And while the courtroom was captivated by this homophobic circus, the actual physical evidence that held the real truth of what happened that night was sitting completely ignored in an evidence locker. When a trial stretches on for almost 5 months, it stops becoming a legal proceeding and becomes a war of attrition. By the time the jury finally retreats to deliberate in the fall of 2003, they've been absolutely saturated in the prosecution's narrative. They've seen the blown up photos of Michael Peterson's private emails, they've listened to Frida Black's pure tea filth speech, and crucially, they've been handed a seemingly undeniable piece of science to back up the state's moral panic. Because right alongside the character assassination, the prosecution brought in Duane Deaver. Duane Deaver was the blood spatter expert for North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. As he stood in front of the jury and confidently testified that the blood on the walls of that stairwell proved definitely that Michael Peterson stood over Kathleen and beat her to death. He even brought in a dummy, beat it with a weapon, and showed the jury the spatter. It looked scientific. It looked objective. But we now know, and we'll get into the gritty, corrupt details of this later, that Deaver was completely fabricating his evidence. He was running junk science experiments designed specifically to give the prosecution the answers they wanted. But in 2003, the jury didn't know that at all. All the jury knew was that the state had a blood expert pointing the finger at Michael, and they had a motive built on a secret bisexual double life. For 4 days, the jury deliberates. 4 days of Michael Peterson sitting in a sterile room, waiting to find out if the rest of his life will be spent in a cage. On October 10th, 2003, word comes down. The jury has a verdict. The courtroom is packed tight. The air is completely still. The foreperson stands up and reads the decision. Guilty. First-degree murder. Michael Peterson doesn't scream. He doesn't collapse. He just stands there, stunned, his face completely devoid of color, as the judge hands down the mandatory sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He is handcuffed in the middle of the courtroom. The Durham police, the same police he had relentlessly criticized in his newspaper columns, lead him out of the room, load him into a transport van, and drive him to the Nash Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison. For the prosecution, it's a massive, career-defining victory. For the media, it's a perfect ending to a salacious true crime soap opera. The killer is behind bars. The secret life was exposed. Case closed. Except the case isn't closed. Because while Michael Peterson was trading his khakis for a prison jumpsuit, a man named T. Lawrence Pollard was sitting at his kitchen table a few streets over, staring at a stack of crime scene photos. Pollard wasn't a cop. He wasn't on the defense team. He was just a neighbor, an attorney, and a guy who couldn't let go of the physical impossibilities of Kathleen's autopsy. He was looking at the photos of the lacerations. He's reading the list of trace evidence found on Kathleen's body, and his eyes catch on a single line on the report. A line the defense ignored, a line the prosecution didn't care about. Item number 12, microscopic feathers, found tangled in the victim's own hair, clutched in her left hand. The police had locked up the husband, but Pollard realizes they completely missed the predator that was waiting in the trees. When T. Lawrence Pollard read that single line in the evidence report, microscopic feathers found tangled in the victim's hair, he didn't just see a typo or an anomaly. He saw the woods surrounding the Peterson mansion, and he knew exactly who owned the night out there. Enter the barred owl. We're not talking about a cute little bird sitting in a bird bath. The barred owl is an apex predator. They're native to the woods in Durham, North Carolina, and in December, during their nesting and mating season, they are violently territorial. Let's talk about the mechanics of an owl strike, because this is where the physical impossibilities of Kathleen's autopsy suddenly snap into focus. If a human hits you with a metal pipe, it cracks your skull. But an owl operates on entirely different physics. A barred owl only weighs about 2 pounds, but it has a wingspan of nearly 4 feet. Its feathers are highly specialized with serrated edges, allowing the air to pass through them completely silent. So you don't hear them coming, and they drop out of the trees like a ghost. When they attack a large mammal like a human who has wandered too close to a nest, they targeted the highest part of the body, and that's the head. And their weapons, of course, are their talons. Owls have zygodactyl feet. This means 2 toes facing forward and 2 backwards, but the outer toe can rotate. When a barred owl strikes the back of a human head, it hits with incredible velocity, sinking those razor-sharp talons straight through the skin to grip the bone. They don't crack the skull, they puncture the scalp, and as the owl pushes off to take flight again, those talons rake backwards, ripping the flesh open. When ornithologists and neurologists finally looked at the autopsy photos of Kathleen Peterson, they didn't see random chaotic cuts of a metal blowpoke. They saw perfect anatomical trident pattern. They saw the exact spread and gouge marks of a barred owl's talons. Let's take the prosecution's homophobic motive and throw it into the trash. Let's take the fake blood spatter science and throw it out. If we only look at the physical evidence, the microscopic feathers, the cedar needles found in the hair, the trident lacerations, the intact skull, and the blood on the front porch, let's look at a timeline of what most likely happens. Like we said before, it's around midnight. Michael is out by the pool, and Kathleen decides to go back inside, but instead of going straight to bed, she walks out to the front porch, likely to check on the large illuminated wooden reindeer decorations in the front yard. A couple minutes later, a barred owl nesting in the heavy pine trees near the driveway perceives her as a threat. It swoops down silently and strikes her on the back of the head. The talons sink to the bone and rake backwards. Kathleen is instantly bleeding profusely from the scalp wounds, bleeding more heavily than anywhere else she would on the body. She throws her hands up to protect her head, grabbing her own hair and inadvertently ripping out the owl's microscopic feathers in the process. She runs for the front door, leaving the isolated drops of blood on the walkway and smearing blood on the outside of the door frame as she pushes her way in. At this point, she's in shock, disoriented and bleeding heavily. She bypasses the kitchen and heads for the narrow back staircase to go up to the bedroom or the bathroom. She starts up the stairs, but the blood loss causes her to faint. She falls backwards, striking her head on the sharp wooden edges of the stairs, compounding the bleeding. She attempts to stand up, creating the bloody footprints and smears on the wall, but she falls again, eventually bleeding to death at the bottom of the stairs. Then, around 2:40, Michael comes inside, finds her body, and makes the frantic 911 call we heard in the cold open. So I get it. It's a freak, million-to-one collision with nature. It sounds absurd until you face the actual evidence. The owl theory is the only theory that accounts for 100% of the forensic data. But in 2003, no one wanted to hear it. The prosecution had their deviant villain, the media had their ratings, and Michael Peterson was rotting in a maximum security cell. It would take over a decade and the exposure of a massive corruption within the state's forensic lab for the truth to even get a second glance. For 8 solid years, Michael Peterson sits in a maximum security prison cell. The media moves on. The Durham Police Department takes their victory lap. The system worked, right? They got their deviant who beat his wife to death. But while Michael is wearing a state-issued jumpsuit and watching his 60s slip away, a completely separate investigation is quietly tearing through the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. In 2010, an independent audit of the SBI crime lab drops like a bomb. It reveals massive, systematic corruption. We aren't talking about accidental lab contamination. We're talking about analysts actively hiding evidence, falsifying reports, and committing perjury to help prosecutors secure their convictions. And sitting right at the center of this corruption scandal is the state's star witness, Duane Deaver, the blood spatter expert who testified that Michael beat Kathleen to death with a blowpoke. It turns out Deaver was running a junk science factory. In multiple cases, if a blood test came back negative, meaning it favored the defense, Deaver would just hide the results. In Michael's case, Deaver ran experiments hitting a sponge with a stick to recreate the spatter in the stairwell. He ran the test dozens of times until he finally got the pattern he wanted, and he hid all the failed attempts from the jury. By 2011, Duane Deaver is fired, and the defense team pounces. They file a motion for a new trial, and they end up back in front of Judge Orlando Hudson, the exact same judge who presided over the original 2003 circus. Judge Hudson listens to the evidence of Deaver's perjury. He looks at how the state built a capital murder case on the back of fraud. And Judge Hudson does something incredibly rare. He vacates the jury's verdict. He rules that Duane Deaver misled the court, completely tainting the trial. Michael Peterson is released on bond and placed under house arrest. He walks out of prison not because of the owl theory and not because the state admits they were wrong about his sexuality. He walks out because the justice system finally admits its own expert lied on the stand. By vacating the verdict, it doesn't mean that Michael is fully exonerated. It just means the state of North Carolina has to retrial him all over again. So the clock resets. But as the years drag on towards the retrial, the landscape has completely changed. By 2017, Michael Peterson is 73 years old. He's completely bankrupt. He spent millions on his original defense and appeals. The idea of sitting through another multi-month trial facing a justice system that fundamentally believes it's rigged against them, it's agonizing. The prosecution is also backed into a corner. The star blood expert is a disgrace. The blowpoke theory is a joke. And crucially, the owl theory has gained massive scientific traction over the last decade. They know if they go to trial again, they might actually lose. So they make a deal. On February 24th, 2017, Michael Peterson walks into the Durham courtroom and enters an Alford plea to the reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter. If you aren't familiar with the legal terminology, an Alford plea is one of the strangest loopholes in the American justice system. It's a guilty plea in name only. When you take an Alford plea, you look at the judge in the eye and say, I'm 100% innocent of this crime. I did not do it. But I acknowledge that the state has enough evidence that the jury might convict me anyway. It's the ultimate compromise. The state gets to keep the conviction on their books and save face. The defendant gets to maintain their innocence and avoid a trial. The judge accepts the plea and sentences Michael to 86 months in prison. But Michael has already served 89 and a half months before his conviction was overturned. He is given credit for time served. He stands up from the defense table, walks out the wooden doors of the Durham County Courthouse, and for the first time in 16 years, Michael Peterson steps out of that North Carolina courtroom as a free man. When you look back at the entire sprawling saga of the Michael Peterson case, it's easy to get lost in the bizarre nature of the owl theory. It's easy to focus on the feather, the talons, and the freak accident timeline. But if we only focus on the owl, we let the real monsters of the story off the hook. The tragedy of 1810 Cedar Street isn't just that Kathleen Peterson died a terrifying, agonizing death. The tragedy is that she was denied an actual, objective investigation because a petty, vindictive police department saw an opportunity to bury a loud critic. The Durham investigators didn't have a weapon. They didn't have an autopsy that matched their theory. They didn't have a motive. But what they did have was a man's private, bisexual life. And so, a disgusting, bigoted prosecution team led by Freda Black looked at a conservative, early 2000s landscape of the American South and realized they didn't need physical evidence. They just needed homophobia. They marched a sex worker into the courtroom simply to put a face on the deviance. They flashed private photos on a screen and called it purity filth. They asked the jury to look at a man's sexuality and equate it with a homicidal urge. It was a moral panic disguised as a murder trial. And when that bigotry wasn't quite enough to seal the deal, they brought in Duane Deaver to literally fabricate the science, bearing the truth under fake blood-spatter tests. The justice system didn't fail in the Michael Peterson case. It functioned exactly the way it was designed to function when prejudice takes the wheel. The police ignored literal feathers clutched in a dead woman's hand, because an owl doesn't get you a headline, and an owl doesn't put a newspaper critic in its cage. Michael Peterson lost 16 years of his life. Kathleen Peterson's family was dragged through decades of agonizing public trauma. All of it happened because there were people sworn to find the truth that decided that weaponizing a man's identity was easier than doing their job. Did Michael Peterson do it? I don't know. Is the owl theory correct? I don't know. I want to believe in the owl theory when all is said and done, but we'll never know what really happens. He spent 16 years in prison. Is it enough? I don't know. And that's it for this week's episode of Homicidal Tendency. Thank you so much for listening. If this episode made you angry, it's a good thing. Even if he did it, the prosecution used the wrong thing to convict him. Take that energy and use it. Support the LGBT plus legal defense funds. Keep demanding accountability from your local justice systems and keep asking the hard questions. If you want to see the crime scene photos, the autopsy diagrams, and yes, the barred owl talent comparisons, head over to our Instagram and TikTok at Homocidal Tendency. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening right now. It costs nothing and it means the absolute world to me. I'm Matt. Keep your eyes open, watch the trees, and I'll see you next time.